September 23, 1944. A draw in the southern Umurbrogol mountains 8 days into a battle that was supposed to be over on day 3. An amphibious tractor grinds up the broken coral, slow and exposed, its hull already scarred, where a machine gun would normally sit. There is a flame projector. The crew carries napalm in the tanks and a cave mouth in front of them, one of hundreds cut into the ridge. The gunner opens up. 80 seconds of fire, a rope of burning fuel reaching out 150 yards, washing across the rock and pouring into the opening. Then it stops. The men wait, and the cave is still firing. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. The entrance had been cut on a slant. A Japanese colonel named Kunio Nakagawa had ordered the mouths of these caves angled and baffled for one specific reason. He expected the Americans to come with flame, so he shaped the rock to make the fire lick the walls and burn out before it reached men 30 feet back in the limestone. The amtrac had delivered everything it carried. The defenders had felt heat, smoke, and nothing worse. That is the part of the Peleliu story that usually gets compressed into a single sentence and then forgotten. The flame was real. The 500 positions were real. The 6 days were a fantasy that died on the beach, because the men who landed here had been promised the whole island in 3. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, told his officer exactly that. His words, recorded by the men who heard them, were raw but fast. He added, "We'll be through in 3 days. It might take only 2. The day before the landing, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, who ran the naval bombardment, announced that his gunners had run out of targets. Of 36 reporters accredited for the operation, 30 left to cover battles they thought would last longer. Peleliu was declared secure on November 27th, 73 days after the Marines went ashore. The campaign cost the Americans roughly 1,794 dead and more than 8,000 wounded. The machine that could have made the title true, a purpose-built flame tank that could carry fire into these caves under real armor, did not exist yet. It was still being engineered in a workshop in Hawaii. Peleliu is the battle that proved America needed it. This is a forensic audit of why 500 holes in a coral ridge defeated the most powerful navy on Earth, why fire was the only tool that worked and still was not enough, and why a battle that should never have been fought changed the way the rest of the Pacific War was waged. To understand why anyone was on Peleliu at all, you have to follow an argument between 2 of the most powerful men in the American military. By the late summer of 1944, Douglas MacArthur was preparing to return to the Philippines. He worried about his eastern flank, specifically Japanese airfields in the Peleliu Islands that could strike his forces as they moved north. Peleliu had one of those airfields. The plan to take it, codenamed Stalemate 2, was handed to Admiral Chester Nimitz and assigned to Major General Roy Geiger's III Amphibious Corps, built around Rupertus's 1st Marine Division, with the Army's 81st Infantry Division in support. Not everyone thought the island was worth a single American life. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, looked at the Palaus and concluded they posed little real threat to the advance on the Philippines. He recommended bypassing Peleliu entirely. By mid-September, he was pushing hard to cancel the operation outright. Nimitz overruled him for reasons that have never been fully explained, and the landing went ahead. On the morning of September 15th at 8:32, the Marines started across a coral reef 500 yards wide. For a few minutes, the amtracs moved in something close to silence. Some of the men were singing. Then, Nakagawa's pre-registered mortars and artillery opened up on coordinates his gunners had measured weeks earlier. The singing stopped. Amphibious tractors erupted in the water. Bodies went into the air. By the end of the first day, the division had taken around 1,300 casualties. For a unit that had fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, it was the first time it had ever landed against a beach that fired back at full strength. Nakagawa did one thing that day that fit the old playbook. He sent a tank counterattack rolling toward the airfield, 17 light tanks with infantry riding alongside. Marine Shermans, bazookas, and naval gunfire shredded it in minutes. He lost most of his armor and a full infantry battalion in that single push. He never made that mistake again, and here is the irony that sat at the center of the whole battle. The Americans took the airfield by the second day, almost on Rupertus's schedule. The easy part went more or less to plan. The hard part was a colonel and a mountain, and the colonel had spent 5 months making sure the mountain would not fall in 3 days or 30. Kunio Nakagawa was 46 years old, the commander of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Division, a unit of veterans who had fought in China. His superior, Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue, had handpicked him to defend Peleliu and arrived him on the island in the spring of 1944, with Major General Kenjiro Murai placed alongside him as the senior officer present. He had something close to 11,000 men, of whom roughly 6,500 were trained combat infantry. The rest were naval troops and Korean and Okinawan laborers. What Nakagawa understood earlier than most of his own high command was that defending the beach was a way to die quickly for nothing. The U.S. Naval Institute's account of the battle makes the timing clear. By the time Tokyo formally distributed a new doctrine that forbade beachfront defense, and Banzai charges in favor of a long battle of attrition, Nakagawa had already hired mining engineers and started building. He was ahead of his own orders. The center of Peleliu rose into a chaos of coral ridges, sinkholes, and cliffs the Americans called the Umurbrogol, and soon renamed Bloody Nose Ridge. Inside it sat roughly 500 caves. Many of them were not dug for war at all. They were old phosphate mine shafts cut years earlier by a Japanese firm called the South Seas Development Company, which had worked the deposits on the island with native labor and hand-pushed rail carts. Nakagawa's engineers turned a mining operation into a fortress. They connected the caves with tunnels. They fitted entrances with sliding armored steel doors that could open for a gun to fire and close again before counterfire arrived. They angled and baffled the openings so flame and grenades could not reach the chambers behind them. They positioned weapons on reverse slopes, where naval shells flying flat overhead could not touch them. Some caves were small enough for one sniper. Others were large enough to hold 1,000 men with their mortars, their 20mm cannon, and their stores. The title of this video calls them Unsinkable bunkers. The truth is stranger and more impressive. They were mostly not bunkers in the sense of poured concrete forts. They were a living, breathing cave system inside coral limestone, and the coral itself was the defense. Naval gunfire and airstrikes deliver killing force through blast and fragments, which spend themselves against rock of any real thickness. Against a man sitting deep inside the Umurbrogol, 3 days of shelling and an admiral running out of targets meant almost nothing. Nakagawa had not built a wall. He had built a system that could absorb a position being overrun and then reoccupy it through a tunnel the attackers did not know existed. The whole island could, in a real sense, regenerate. A marine company could take a ridgeline in the morning, lose 24 men doing it, set up a perimeter, and wake the next day to find Japanese defenders back in positions they had held the day before, having moved through the rock itself overnight. Every officer who later studied Iwo Jima and Okinawa was looking at the children of what one colonel built on Peleliu first. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With the airfield taken, the Marines turned toward the ridges, and the battle stopped resembling anything in the planning documents. Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Marines drew the worst of it. One of his colonels, Harold Harris, flew over the Umurbrogol, saw what waited inside it, argued that the position should be approached from the north, away from where the Japanese clearly expected the attack. Puller and Rupertus, both aggressive men, dismissed the idea and ordered a direct assault from the south, straight into the prepared crossfire. The regiment paid a price for that decision that is hard to overstate. The 1st Marines entered the battle with about 3,300 men. After 2 weeks of fighting in the ridges, they were pulled from the line with 1,749 casualties, a rate above 50%. Some companies came out with fewer than a third of the men they went in with. Puller himself refused to leave the island for medical treatment while his men were in the fight, conducting operations on a leg wound that should have taken him off the line days earlier. His persistence was genuine and admirable, and made no difference to the mathematics of what his regiment was losing in those ridges. The heat was a secondary enemy that the planning had not properly accounted for. Temperatures on Peleliu regularly exceeded 100 degrees. The coral reflected heat upward from below while the sun drove it down from above. Men on the ridges were burning through their water faster than supply could replace it. Salt tablets ran short. Casualties accumulated alongside combat casualties, and the distinction between the two sometimes blurred in the casualty reports because a man collapsed from heat exhaustion in a firefight was still a man who was no longer able to fight. The weapons available were wrong for this problem in ways that became obvious within the first week and could not be quickly fixed. Grenades rolled off the sloped coral before they could find an opening. Flamethrowers worked when a man could get close enough to use them, which required crossing ground that Nakagawa's gunners had been ranging for months. Rifles and machine guns were of limited use against men firing from inside rock, who could withdraw when fire became accurate and reappear when it shifted. Mortars could not reach positions on reverse slopes. The 75mm pack howitzers that accompanied the Marines forward were effective against field fortifications, the kind of earthwork and timber construction they had fought on Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. Against coral cave entrances, fitted with steel doors, they were a partial answer at best: naval gunfire. The resource everyone had assumed would solve the island before the Marines arrived turned out to have a specific and consistent limitation. A shell fired from a ship offshore arrives on a relatively flat trajectory. It strikes the face of a slope and explodes there. A man inside the slope, behind the face, is protected by the same rock the shell is hitting. Plunging fire from naval guns was harder to arrange against targets in the interior ridges, and the terrain made it difficult for spotters to confirm where rounds were landing. What worked, when it was available, was the M4 Sherman with the E45 flamethrower fitted to its hull. The flame tank could park below a cave entrance, raise its gun to the angle required, and project burning fuel directly into the opening. The rock did not protect against that. The steel doors did not protect against that, but the flamethrower Shermans were few. Their fuel supply was limited, and getting them into position on the broken coral terrain of the Umurbrogol was work that cost time, and sometimes cost the tank crew their lives, before they could fire. The Marines who fought in those ridges developed a method that was less a tactic than a ritual. A team would approach a cave entrance under covering fire. One man would push forward with a flamethrower on his back, lay down a burst of fire into the opening, and pull back before the return fire found him. Then grenades, then more fire. Then a check to see if the opening was clear, which it sometimes was and sometimes was not. If it was not clear, the process started again. This was the battle Rupertus had said would last 2 or 3 days. It lasted 73. By the time the island was declared secure, Nakagawa had conducted his defense with a precision that impressed the American officers who studied the records afterward. He had managed his ammunition carefully, rotating units through rest positions inside the cave system, maintaining communications across a network the Americans never fully mapped. Near the end, with his force reduced to a few dozen men, he burned his regimental colors and transmitted a formal message to his superiors before his final position was overrun. The Americans found the ashes, the flame tank that could have shortened the fight, a Sherman with an armored flame projector replacing the main gun, giving it both the armor protection to survive close approach and the firepower to burn deep into a prepared cave system, was completed at the Naval Ordnance Facility in Hawaii in late 1944. It arrived in the Pacific in time for Iwo Jima. The Marines who used it there knew exactly what it was for, because the men who survived Peleliu had told them. Peleliu did not change the outcome of the Pacific War. The airfield the planners had argued over was used for a handful of missions and then largely abandoned as the front moved north. Halsey had been right about its strategic value. What the island changed was the American understanding of what the next year of fighting would require. What weapons, what tactics, what willingness to pay a cost that no general's pre-battle confidence could honestly predict. Because the man waiting in the mountain had spent 5 months making sure the prediction would be wrong. The fighting that defined Peleliu happened at a feature called The Point on the far left of the landing. Captain George Hunt's K Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, was ordered to take it. The point was studded with coral pillboxes, including a casemate holding a 47mm gun. Hunt's men worked close enough to throw grenades through a firing slit. One grenade set off the gun's stored shells. The Japanese crew came stumbling out with their clothing on fire and their ammunition belts cooking off around their waists, and a Marine fire team waiting on the flank cut them down as they came. Taking the point was only the start. Over the next 30 hours, Nakagawa counterattacked the position 4 times. Hunt's company, low on water, nearly out of ammunition, and almost surrounded, fought him off with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. By the time relief arrived, K Company had been reduced to 18 effective men and had suffered around 157 casualties. Hunt received the Navy Cross. The arithmetic of holding one rocky outcrop tells you everything about what the other 499 positions were going to cost. Eugene Sledge, who fought here with the 5th Marines and later wrote one of the finest combat memoirs ever published, described watching what happened to the men beside him. He wrote that his own regiment had plenty of dead and wounded to grieve, but that the men in the 1st Marines had so many it was appalling. When the 7th Marines took over the job of reducing the central pocket on September 29th, they began a 2-week rotation that cost the regiment 46% casualties. The only method that produced any progress at all was a brutal one, a satchel charge to crack the position, a flamethrower to burn it out, and then more explosives to seal it shut. By early October, the surviving Japanese had been squeezed into an area roughly 900 yards by 400. American losses by that point already ran near 900 dead and 4,500 wounded. Rupertus had declared the island secure on September 30th, while the pocket was still killing his men daily. Geiger, watching the casualty reports, ordered him to hand the battle to the army. On October 30th, Major General Paul Mueller's 81st Infantry Division took over the reduction of a fortress that was supposed to have fallen 8 weeks earlier. If you have made it this far, you already understand that the men who climbed those ridges were not lacking in courage. The variable that decided Peleliu was never bravery. It was whether anyone could find a way to kill a man sitting inside solid rock. If a relative of yours fought in the Palaus, in the 1st Marine Division, or the 81st Infantry, I would be honored to hear their name and their unit in the comments. The records keep the numbers. The comment section keeps the people. This is where the flame comes in, and where the title's promise meets physics. Flame was the one weapon that reliably did to a cave what nothing else could. Burning fuel in an enclosed space does not only kill by touch. It eats the oxygen, fills the chamber with smoke and carbon monoxide, and makes the air itself impossible to breathe. The Marines knew this, and the demolition squads on Peleliu worked by a grim and simple creed that one veteran summed up as blast them, burn them, then blast them again to bring the roof down. The fire came from 2 places, and a purpose-built flame tank was not one of them. Some of it came off the back of a man. A backpack flamethrower weighed around 70 pounds, made the operator the most hunted target on the ridge, and ran dry in seconds. The rest came from amphibious tractors fitted with flame projectors. The official Marine Corps history records their reach precisely. With a gasoline and oil mixture, the flame stretched about 75 yards. With napalm, it reached 150, and a single load burned for around 80 seconds. To get those amtracs anywhere near the caves, Army and Marine engineers ran bulldozers up the slopes and cut paths through the coral, while the higher positions still had to be reached by infantry, climbing with the burden on their backs. Aircraft dropped napalm too, but the official history is honest about what it accomplished. Its most useful job was burning away the brush and vegetation that hid the cave mouths, occasionally exposing a position no one had known was there. There is at least one substantiated report of the heat driving a small group of Japanese into the open where they could be shot. That was the exception, not the rule. The flame produced moments that were almost unimaginable. On Hill 140, an LVT flamethrower worked its way up a draw and put fire into a cave that turned out to hold a 12-inch naval shell. The shell detonated and blew away a large section of the hillside. By some miracle, it cost only one Marine wounded. And now the part the title leaves out entirely. Nakagawa had built these caves specifically to beat fire, and against a great many of them, fire lost. The slanted entrances did their job. The reverse slope chambers stayed cool, while flame burned itself out at the doorway. One large blockhouse on the island proved immune to flamethrowers and to 75mm tank guns alike, and the Marines only cracked it by stacking it with plastic explosive and detonating the whole thing, so picture the real pace of it. Not a column of tanks sweeping an island clean in 6 days, but small teams working one hole at a time for 73 days, taking casualties at every single position, while the colonel who built the system fed men back into cleared caves through tunnels in the dark. The dedicated Sherman flame tank that later Marines would call the most valuable weapon they had, the one with real armor and 300 gallons of fuel, had not been built when Peleliu was fought. It would make its combat debut at Iwo Jima in February of 1945. Peleliu is the tuition America paid to learn that lesson. The bill was written in the 1st Marine Division. By early November, the pocket had shrunk to a sliver of the ridge, and Nakagawa was running out of everything. By the 8th, fewer than 300 Japanese remained inside the Umurbrogol, and they kept fighting. By the 24th, after 70 days of combat, the colonel who had bled the Marine Corps white had around 120 men left, more than half of them too badly wounded to hold a rifle. That evening, with the last command post about to fall, Nakagawa burned his regimental colors so they could not be taken, and then he committed seppuku. Murai died with him. Tokyo posthumously promoted Nakagawa to lieutenant general. On November 27th, the island was declared secure, 73 days after the landing that was meant to take 3. Run the audit on what that bought. Of the island's roughly 11,000 defenders, about 10,695 were killed. The Americans captured only 202 men, and most of those were laborers, not soldiers. American casualties came to around 1,794 dead and more than 8,000 wounded, with the 1st Marine Division absorbing the overwhelming majority. The division was so badly damaged that it had to be pulled out and rebuilt for an airfield. And here, the forensic verdict turns cold, because Halsey had been right. The airfield on Peleliu played only a minor role in the campaign that followed. The location mattered far less than the planners believed. A great many historians now place Peleliu among the most questionable American operations of the entire Pacific War, a battle whose objective could very likely have been bypassed and left to wither under air and sea power the way Halsey had urged from the start. But the battle was not without consequence, and the consequence is the reason it belongs in this series. Peleliu was the proving ground for a way of fighting. Nakagawa demonstrated, against the most lavishly equipped enemy on Earth, that the defender who went underground refused to die on the beach and turned a coral ridge into a regenerating fortress could impose a cost out of, all proportion to his numbers. The Japanese High Command studied that result. Within months, Tadamichi Kurabayashi applied it on Iwo Jima, and Mitsuru Ushijima applied it on Okinawa, each on a far larger scale. And the American answer To all of it, the flame weapon that could finally carry fire into a cave and survive the trip was developed because Peleliu had shown, hole by hole and corpse by corpse, that the tools on hand in September of 1944 were not enough. Go to Peleliu today, and the proof is still there. An amphibious tractor sits rusting beside the Umurbrogol, where it was abandoned. The rock around the cave mouths still carries scorch marks from flamethrowers fired 80 years ago. The caves themselves are mostly intact, home now to colonies of fruit bats, the steel doors, and the angled entrances exactly as Nakagawa's engineers left them. They do not look like the most important defensive system of their year. They look like holes in a quiet ridge on a small tropical island that almost no one remembers. George Hunt's 18 survivors knew what those holes were worth. So did Eugene Sledge, who carried Peleliu in his head for the rest of his life and wrote it down so the rest of us would understand. The men who climbed those ridges with 70 pounds of fire on their backs knew the odds better than anyone, and they went up anyway, cave at a time, for 73 days. If this forensic audit changed how you understand Peleliu, that it was not a fast flame victory, but the brutal lesson that taught America how the rest of the Pacific would be fought, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to put this kind of history in front of people who actually want it. Subscribe if you want to be here when we follow this exact weapon and this exact tactic to the islands that came next. The island was supposed to fall in 3 days. It took 73. The fire was real. The caves were built to beat it. War is mathematics. And on Peleliu, the equation cost more than it was ever worth.